Now recording, and I'm stopping my sharing.
There we go. Welcome everybody on this St. Valentine's Day, and also, of course, Chinese Happy New Year, the year of the strong and reliable ox. So those of you who were born as an ox, thank you very much. As Siobhan said, you'll all be on mute until question period at about 10 o'clock, at which time Siobhan and I will take questions from chat. So any questions that you have, you can put in chat at any time, or of course, after 10 o'clock. So for our presentation today, well, as you all know, we're living in a climate crisis, but Ontario's current plan is for electricity emissions to increase up to the year 2040, which is pretty awful. Ontario should be heading to low-cost, zero-emission electricity, and Ontario Clean Air Alliance has plans for that. The Alliance was formed in 1997 and is widely recognized as the organization that led the drive to end coal electricity generation in Ontario. And that's widely recognized as the largest single greenhouse gas reduction measure in North America. It resulted in a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions of 34 megatons annually, close to 6 times Ottawa's current total emissions. The move also saved at least 700 deaths annually from air pollution and reduced numerous adverse effects on public health and ecosystems. Since the coal phase out, the Ontario Clean Air Alliance has been a consistent advocate for an electricity system that phases out natural gas power generation by 2030. It's based on energy efficiency, renewables, and imports of electricity from Quebec, which at the same time will bring economic advantages for Ontario consumers. This campaign is backed by a lot of environmental, business, and faith organizations, including us here at First Unitarian Congregation of Ottawa. It's also backed by municipal council motions in many Ontario communities. The Ontario Clean Air Alliance is registered charity chaired by Jack Gibbs, a former commissioner of Toronto Hydro, and its director is Angela Bischoff. Angela has worked with the environmental nonprofit sector for more than 3 decades in 4 Canadian cities on issues ranging from climate change to transportation, to waste, to energy, to elections. So welcome, Angela. Thank you for coming to talk to us about the Alliance's plans for emission-free electricity by 2030.
Thank you, Sherry, and to all of you for joining me on this Valentine's Day morning. Happy New Year and happy Valentine's Day to everybody. Okay, I'll just go ahead and share my screen and my slides. And thank you for the you explained a lot in your opening there, Sherry. Okay. Great. Okay, so here we go. So as Sherry mentioned, we are behind Ontario's coal phase out. We were formed in 1997 to call for the coal phase out campaign. It took 17 years, but Ontario then was the first jurisdiction in the world, perhaps, that phased out coal for environmental and health reasons. And since winning that campaign, we turned our attention to moving Ontario to 100% renewable electricity grid. And that means phasing out our gas and our nuclear power plants. As Sherry mentioned, we're led by Jack Gibbs. He's an economist, an energy economist. So we very regularly put our arguments into economic arguments, also environmental. So this shows you how we get our electricity in Ontario right now. You can see the bulk of our electricity comes from nuclear power. This is very unusual. We are the second most nuclearized jurisdiction in the world with our 18 working nuclear reactors. The only country in the world that gets more power from nuclear for their grid is France, and they've committed to reducing their reliance on nuclear power to 50%, at which point Ontario would be the most nuclearized jurisdiction in the world. I just point that out to give you a sense, the big picture, that we are very heavily reliant on one type of energy. You can see wind and solar, we're around 10%. We lead the country. Ontario leads the country in wind and solar electricity, though we'll soon fall behind that because, of course, the Ford government, first thing they did when they were elected is cancel 758 renewable energy projects that were shovel ready, and also canceled our conservation programs. At present, we get 7 or 8% of our electricity from gas. That's down from about 15% a decade earlier. So the previous government had reduced gas substantially in our province, and then a quarter of our electricity comes from water power, clean, renewable. So this shows you the emissions projection for the province. You can, so from the electricity sector, greenhouse gas emissions. You can see from 2005 along the bottom, from 2005 to 2017, we reduced our reliance on gas, essentially, and coal. And that reduced our emissions substantially. But starting 2017, they started increasing again. And the projections from the Independent Electricity System Operator of Ontario are that we will increase greenhouse gas pollution from the electricity sector 300% by 2030 and 500% by 2040. And why would that be? A few reasons. The demand for electricity is projected to rise about 1% per year. It doesn't have to rise. We can project to reduce it, as we have in the recent decade. We've reduced demand substantially, but the IESO has their directions from government. They project about a 1% increase per year. The Pickering nuclear station is expected to close in 2024, though their OPG is requesting an extension on that. And virtually all of the new electricity sources will come from gas. That's what the province's plan is at the present. So if you look at Ontario's gas, these are the large, I think we have about 40 gas plants in Ontario, but 5 of the largest are owned by OPG, and you can see where they are in southern Ontario. And this makes the province the largest gas power producer in the province. Let's look at our nuclear power reactors in the province. So we have, I mentioned, 18 working nuclear reactors, 8 power reactors in Pickering. That's just, you see the picture there, that's a picture of Pickering Beach. And you can see how close it is to one of the world's oldest and largest nuclear stations with its 8 power reactors, of which 2 have already closed down, and the other 6 are extended well beyond their design life. They were designed to last 30 years, and they're now 49, and OPG has permission to run them until age 53, and we know that they're requesting an extension beyond that. We have 4 reactors 20 kilometers further east of Pickering. So Pickering is 30 kilometers from downtown Toronto, and then 20 kilometers further east, also on Lake Ontario, is a very large nuclear station, 4 reactors at Darlington, and OPG wants to rebuild all 4 of those reactors, locking us in to high cost nuclear power for another 4 decades. And then OPG also wants to build what they call it SMR, small modular nuclear reactor at Darlington, so a new reactor. The largest nuclear station in the world is the Bruce nuclear station with its 8 reactors. And Bruce Power is rebuilding all 8 reactors. They've already rebuilt 2. They're planning to rebuild the other 6. The province has committed to purchasing that power. There were 2 reactors built in Quebec. They've both closed when they came to the end. Well, they both closed, and 1 in New Brunswick, which has been rebuilt. So this back to Ontario, this is Ontario's electricity options and the prices of our electricity options. Starting from the left, energy efficiency is our lowest cost source of electricity, essentially. In 2017, the IESO procured conservation at an average rate of 1.7 cents a kilowatt hour. That is, much cheaper than any of our other options. So reducing demand is the cheapest way to manage our electricity supply. And then Quebec Power at 2.2 cents. The bulk of their electricity exports are sold on the spot market. They really want long-term contracts, and they've offered Ontario long-term contract. In 2017, they offered us a long-term contract at 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So those are very low-cost options for us. We're fortunate to live next door to one of the fourth largest water power producers in the world, and they have massive surplus. Next is solar and onshore wind power. And Lazard, one of the world's large financial management organizations, they claim that solar is on average sold today between 3.8 and 5.5 cents a kilowatt hour, and onshore wind between 3.4 and 7 cents. So, and the International Energy Agency claims that 95% of new supply moving forward in the next decade will come from renewable power sources. So those are now very low cost options. They weren't 20 years ago or 10 years ago when we were first rolling out solar and wind in this province, but now the prices have come down so substantially and the world is moving to a renewable future. The 9.6 bar, that's the price that we pay OPG today to produce our nuclear power. So that's already quite a bit more than, like double if we were to import water power from Quebec instead. Offshore wind, 11 cents, a little bit more, prices coming down again with economies of scale. And then in OPG projects that they will be charging us 12.8 cents a kilowatt hour to produce electricity in nuclear electricity in 2026. And then they want to produce a small modular nuclear reactor at Darlington. The nuclear industry claims it will be costing 16.3 cents to produce electricity. And that's just an estimate. If anything, it'll be much more than that. And it might take a lot longer than that. So very high cost option we're exploring. So our goal is to phase out gas and nuclear electricity in Ontario and replace it with ramped up energy efficiency investments, Quebec power and storage. We're advocating that we could do a deal with Quebec to actually store or back up our wind and solar in Ontario. The MIT has done an extensive study showing that Quebec's hydro reservoirs could act as the lowest cost battery storage option. And we're proposing made in Ontario wind and solar power, as well as reducing spending on our nuclear rebuilds and new builds. And together we could phase out nuclear and electricity and lower electricity bills. So to give you a sense, I mentioned earlier that the projection is for a 1% increase in electricity in the province over in the coming years. But in fact, between 2005 and 2019, electricity demand reduced by 10%. At the same time, population growth increased 17% and GDP increased 22%. So there is a great opportunity to be reducing demand. As I mentioned earlier, it's the lowest cost option, and we could increase dramatically our investments in conservation, reduce the need to rebuild reactors or to crank up gas plants. I mentioned Quebec power is available, reliable, and low cost. Quebec in 2017 offered us a long-term contract at 5 cents a kilowatt hour. That was, I believe, an 8 terawatt opportunity that we have turned down repeatedly. The Ford government refuses to do a deal with Quebec, despite them offering it for such low cost, a third of the cost of what the province is planning to spend at Darlington for an SMR. It's available now, and we've got the grid between the two provinces. Quebec has massive surplus. They haven't found been able to make long-term contracts. They're selling most of it on the spot market. Legault, the premier, has been begging Ontario to do a deal, and Ontario continues to refuse. The opportunity offered from Quebec is to lower bills across the province. And we know that because the city of Cornwall, they have obtained 100% of their electricity from Quebec for more than 50 years. They're not on the Ontario grid, they're on the Quebec grid, though Cornwall is an Ontario city. And they have by far the lowest electricity rates in the province. So this is kind of a geeky slide, but it shows you how much opportunity there really is right now to import renewable electricity from Quebec using existing transmission links. People always think we have to do massive upgrades to our transmission lines, but we already have the opportunity to import 16 to 18.5 billion kilowatt per year from Quebec with our existing lines. And that alone is equivalent to 3/4 of the output of Darlington. So that's 3 reactors at Darlington could be replaced. Just to give you a sense how big the opportunity is, that's with our existing grid. And Hydro One is investing 24 million, which is a drop in the bucket to be able to import 1650 megawatts by 2022. And that's enough to replace 2 of the Pickering reactors, which when they are scheduled to shut down next year. So there is a great opportunity already with existing interties, but here's 3 options to increase even more capacity in our transmission grid to import more power from Quebec. You can see there's 3 different opportunities. They're each 2,000 megawatts. And at the far right, you can see the price. So the first one is $80 million, and that's to build a line adjacent to or in an existing transmission corridor through Ottawa. So that would cost $80 million. That could bring in 2,000 megawatts of electricity. That's like 2 reactors. And then there's one near an intertie near Cornwall that could be developed, and one near Chat Falls. And just 2 of those, say the first 2, that would come up to $365 million. Just 2 of those, I'm going to shrink that, could eliminate the need for 95% of the 6 Bruce Power reactors that they're planning to rebuild. So they're planning to rebuild those 6 reactors at a cost of $13 billion. Versus these 2 interties that I mentioned were $365 million. So the opportunity offered to Ontario is just astounding. So as advocates, how do we make our agenda happen? So we're using similar campaign techniques that we used for the coal phase out. And that is these 5 options on the right. First, we show that there are alternatives. We prove it. We develop reports and we lay out a roadmap. Second, we build public support. Then we build allies from the NGO, First Nations communities. Then we get cities to sign on. And with the coal phase out, we got 11 cities to sign on. And then we build opposition through the opposition parties provincially. So that was our campaign for the successful campaign during the coal phase out. So now we're doing the same thing with the gas plant phase out. we've drawn up a report, a roadmap, how we could replace our gas plants with a combination of wind, water, solar, and conservation. We've done the same thing, comparing the pricing and the opportunities to replace the planned SMR at Darlington, to replace them with wind and solar in Ontario, what the opportunities would be there and the savings. I've talked a little about the new SMR that OPG wants to build at Darlington, but there's also a whole, besides just the OPG SMR, there is a movement across Canada, and the federal government is already starting to fund. They've an SMR program across the country. The goal is to build supposedly small modular nuclear reactors and put them in First Nations and mining communities across the north. There is a campaign to oppose federal funding for this nuclear rollout, this new nuclear rollout. And over 100 civil society organizations and First Nations groups have already signed on to a statement saying that nuclear reactors are a dirty and dangerous distraction from tackling climate change. So essentially, they're too slow. They're all still on the drawing board. Like, they're at minimum a decade away. The industry says it's at least a decade before they're actually producing electricity. As I mentioned, showed in the earlier slides, they're very expensive. They produce much fewer jobs than renewables per dollar spent. Renewables are available now. The world is moving to a renewable future. Canada almost stands alone in rolling out a new nuclear program. I mentioned earlier that 95% of new electricity supply around the world, according to the International Energy Agency, is going to be renewable moving forward. And SMRs are very dirty and dangerous. They produce the most deadly waste. They have routine emissions, potential accidents, and proliferation concerns, because what they're planning to do is remove plutonium from existing radioactive waste. And that plutonium can be used in nuclear bombs. And I mentioned there's a large opposition growing to federal funding for this program. So one way that we get the word out is through door-to-door, very grassroots, popping leaflets in people's mailboxes. So we have gas leaflets that have been distributed across the province. We have the same thing. We have the same thing for the Freeland campaign, where we're focusing on downtown Toronto. We're distributing leaflets in Chrystia Freeland's riding. And we're doing social media. We've got a billboard in Chrystia Freeland's riding. So we're trying to get the word out very much through the grassroots. We don't have a large advertising budget. The gas plant phase out, we've built allies through the nonprofit communities in Ontario specifically, including in Ottawa. We've got you folks, First Unitarian Congregation of Ottawa. We've got Ecology Ottawa Co-op, Co-Energy Co-op, Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op, and the Ottawa South Eco Action Network are all sign-ons to the gas plant phase-out campaign. And now we're getting municipalities to sign on. You can see on the left, we have 14 municipalities that have already signed on to call on the province to phase out gas-fired power. And Toronto is discussing it and will be voting early March. We've got a team in Ottawa that has been building support with City Council, though we have more work to do there. But another half dozen cities are discussing it in the next couple of weeks. So we're really on a roll. We're already beyond where we were at with the coal phase out in terms of getting municipalities to sign on. And in terms of provincial opposition, we've gotten the Green Party of Ontario. They're fully on side the gas plant phase out. And we have reason to believe that both the NDP and Liberal parties are coming on side, though that hasn't become official yet, but we're working on them. And we have, in terms of you engaging in this campaign or staying informed, we have a petition, OntarioClimateAction.ca, that you can sign, and you can toggle the little box which says keep me informed, and every couple of weeks we'll send you an update on the campaign so that you can engage and help us grow the movement for a gas plant phase out in Ontario. And when you sign that petition, a letter will also be sent to all the provincial party leaders so that they know that you're behind this campaign. The NoNewNuclear.ca, that's our campaign to oppose the SMR at Darlington. Once again, when you go there, a letter will go to Chrystia Freeland and your own MP, so that's federal. And we invite all of you to help us distribute our leaflets. In Ottawa, we would be distributing the gas phase out leaflet to build support municipally for the gas plant phase out campaign. And when it comes before the Ottawa City Council, we will invite you to share and to build support amongst all your members, to send a letter. We'll probably have an action tool for you to send a letter to your city councillor and mayor asking them to support the gas plant phase out, encourage the city of Ottawa to sign on to that. And that's it. I would like to thank you all for hearing my campaign ideas. And I look forward to hearing your questions or comments. Get some discussion going.
Unmuted. So thanks very much for your presentation. Lots of questions have already popped up, so it's a good start. And I'll remind people that this is being recorded currently. And so informal questions can happen after 10 o'clock, and it won't be recorded. So the first question I would pose to you, Angela, is, it keeps moving on me. The cost savings and speed of implementation case is easy to understand and very compelling. So what's the reason that Ontario isn't signing on to this?
The nuclear lobby is very strong in this province. It's the status quo. OPG and Bruce Power are two largest electricity providers in the province, and they produce the bulk of our electricity by gas and nuclear power. So they have the ear of government. They have the Power Workers Union, lots of jobs, and government seems to be beholden to them. It makes no economic rationale or even environmental rationale. There's a lot of money behind these large projects, the $13 billion rebuild of Darlington and the $13 billion rebuild of Bruce Power. There's a lot of money there that, and a lot of businesses and the industry is really fighting to hold on to those contracts. They don't want to give those up to a bunch of, renewable industry, smaller industries, or to Quebec. So the government is doing the bidding, or is protecting the nuclear industry rather than the citizens of Ontario. They're not considering the best interests of the citizens of Ontario.
Okay, another question, more technical, is how does Quebec store Ontario's excess electricity? You mentioned that could be a backup.
Right, so Quebec's hydro reservoirs, when we have lots of wind and solar cranking out power in Ontario, Quebec can keep the power in their reservoirs when we don't need their power. And at nighttime, let's say, or when there's no wind and we need the power during peak, they can release the power through their reservoirs and provide power to Ontario. So it's a load balancing. They can support our wind and solar. We use it when we need it and right? And Quebec peaks in the winter and Ontario peaks in the summer. So they actually really complement each other very well.
Okay, a couple of geography questions and a bit political. Where's Chat Falls, one of the Quebec intertie locations that you mentioned? And Cornwall has made its own decision to be a part of the Quebec system. Can cities just make their own decision like that?
Sherry, maybe I'll just mention in respect of our Francophone friends, Shaw Falls. Shaw, as French word for cat.
Ah, thank you. Obviously it's in Quebec then.
Do you know, Mike, do you know where, I don't know where Shaw Falls is.
It's near Arnprior.
Ah, on the other side of the river.
And can cities make their own decision? Yes, they can. Like Kingston could decide to purchase power from Quebec. It's a little bit more complicated than that because, and I can't explain it, but the provincial government has this legislation in place that you still have to pay for all sorts of base charges. So it ends up pushing the rate much higher. So while Ottawa could choose to purchase their water power from Quebec, they would still be paying a very high price because we're still paying a bunch of the, I don't know if it's distribution charges and different things that will still end up going to our grid. So there would have to be some legislative changes made to make it possible for cities like Ottawa to purchase their water from Quebec. But we're advocating for that. That legislation, that law could change in favor of cities like Ottawa, but we're not there yet.
So do initiatives like bullfrog power and so forth, is that a good way to support alternative energies?
Yeah, it is. And green co-ops, like the co-ops that are members of this campaign. Yeah, absolutely. Those are all good available options. It's still a relatively small sector of the large picture of our grid. But yes, by supporting those smaller initiatives, we're building support. We're slowly building familiarity and understanding in the Ontario population to be able to accept it on a much larger scale.
And another source question. As we move to more electricity for cars, for heating and so forth, has that been taken into account in your projections?
So you're right. There will be an increased demand, especially with cars on the grid. But think about the IESO did a study and said with 1 million cars on Ontario roads becoming electrified, that would only increase demand on the grid by 2%. But if we were to do much more than 1 million cars, like eventually in the next decade, maybe we'll get all trucks and cars and buses on the grid, that will increase even more. And that's where the opportunity is for conservation to reduce demand substantially. Rather than increase demand, we should continue to reduce it. We should spend as much money on conservation as we do on new supply. If we're going to spend 16 cents, up to 16 cents for a new SMR, let's spend that on conservation, reduce the need to build out the new supply. That's what we're advocating for. And we know that conservation is our lowest cost option. So we've only really attempted the low hanging fruit. There's lots more opportunity to reduce our demand. And that's just a political decision. The IESO has decided their projections are for an increased demand of 1%. They could choose to continue to reduce demand and invest in conservation accordingly.
Okay, another question, not necessarily in order, but this is kind of random. Natural gas didn't seem to be included in your cost comparison. And so people are wondering about that. And also for cooks, do we have to get rid of our gas stoves?
So we're referring only to electrical power production. So our gas plant phase out campaign is not calling for a gas phase out across the board for industrial or for heating. Eventually, I think we will be phasing those out, but this campaign is specifically electrical power. And secondly, your first question was?
The natural gas inclusion in the cost comparison.
Right. So first of all, I don't like to use the term natural gas. I'll call it fossil gas or fracked gas. 80% of the gas in Canada is fracked. And natural is just a PR campaign from the industry. So fracked gas. The cost of ramping up our existing gas plants is really relatively little. So because the gas plants have very few jobs and they're relatively unused. So maybe I think the gas plants are only used 10% of the time in Ontario because they're considered more of a peaker option. So they're sitting unused. So the province wants to just bring in way more gas, burn more gas, and that costs nothing because the infrastructure is already there and you don't need to create more jobs. So it's for the province, it's a very low cost option for increasing peaking gas. But that doesn't take into account the environmental impacts of gas. So most of the gas that we receive right now, or all of the gas, comes either from Western Canada, mostly Alberta, and the Pennsylvania basin. And that's primarily fracked gas. The government or OPG wanted to build a new pipeline from the Pennsylvania basin up into Ontario through Hamilton to increase the imports of fracked gas from Pennsylvania. And the environmental impacts of that are not accounted for. So yes, gas is a cheap source of energy, but that's only because they can release emissions up into the air, fugitive emissions when they're fracking, destroying water systems for people where the fracking occurs, and fugitive emissions all along the way. A potent, very potent greenhouse gas, maybe 20 or more times more potent than carbon dioxide. And none of that is factored for in the price of gas. So while financially it's a low cost option for the government, it's environmentally devastating.
Yes, and I have an apology to make. It's been noted that we have lots of French names in Ontario, and I shouldn't just assume that Les Chats is Quebec. It was just because it's Quebec providing the gas that I did that. Anyway, there was also a question about the federal government, recently announcing funding to bring Quebec Hydro to the Maritimes. And so should the feds also be targeting an advocacy campaign to get them to work with Ontario on expanding into using Quebec power?
So the federal government has offered provinces funding to increase interprovincial electricity trade. So in the case of Ontario or the Maritimes, in Ontario's case, we could apply for federal funds to increase to improve interties or create transmission links between Quebec and Ontario. So yes, it's an opportunity, it's a gift that the Ontario government could request of from the federal government. But the province hasn't requested that for whatever reason. They hate water power. Water power is essentially competition to Ontario's gas and nuclear lobby. So Ontario hasn't taken up that opportunity to apply for federal funds. We have advocated for that in the past. We've done actions. We've asked our supporters to send letters to the provincial government, pushing them to request federal funds to increase transmission capacity between Quebec and Ontario. That was just last year. But we just haven't gotten anywhere with this province that is very anti-renewable energy.
So we're sort of being forced to go nuclear. But
Well,
I think
the government, the Ford government is choosing to go nuclear. Yeah, you and I don't have the option. So we continue to advocate. That's what we are as an organization, and encouraging broad public support to go along with our agenda. I mean, most people don't really think about electricity, aren't aware where it comes from or what opportunities there are, what choices we have. So that's why we're we're maybe the only organization in the province that focuses exclusively on electricity and tries to build public support for a renewable electricity future.
a question about hydro itself, though. Large scale hydro is pretty devastating to the environment. And the more export Quebec does, the more it will want to have more large hydro developments. What do you think about that?
So Legault, it was just 2 weeks ago in the news, Legault announced that their future opportunity for increasing supply is coming with wind. And they've actually established a new contract with the First Nation in northern Quebec to produce more wind farms. And Legault also said that there's no opportunity for new dams in Quebec. There's too much opposition, and it's not cost effective anymore. They've already dammed their most cost effective water power options, and it's too expensive now. So the new opportunity is wind and solar, and Legault has acknowledged that. And we as an environmental group, we don't support new dams either. What we do support is using existing resources that are available that have no long-term contracts, that comes from our neighbor, the First Nations, the Cree, the James Bay Cree, they support long-term sales from Quebec to Ontario. And mostly, they didn't initially support the damming of their lands, but they made a precedent-setting agreement with the Canadian and provincial governments, which raised the bar for First Nations across the country. They benefit from greater sales to Ontario. We've been in touch with them. They are supportive of increased sales to Ontario. So nobody is supporting new dams, not the provincial government of Quebec, nor Ontario. We're all supporting using existing resources.
And there's been a question as to why others can't see the questions in chat. I'm perfectly comfortable with that if the Zoom team can allow that. And in the meantime, there is a couple of questions about asking you to repeat what it is that we in this congregation can do with petitions and so on, including social media, and what can we do to get Ottawa to sign on to the campaign?
Okay, well, so we have had some discussions with Ecology Ottawa and one of your councillors. His name is there Sean?
Sean Menard?
Yeah. So with his EA, I guess. We've had a couple of conversations. I know that it's starting to percolate within your council. When we get more information, we'll be reaching out to all our member organizations and asking you to share an action tool with your members where you click on an online letter, and when you punch in your postal code, a letter will go to your own city council, or your own city councilor plus the mayor. So a way to just, like we did that in Toronto when we got, 600 letters sent to the various council members and the mayor to show that there was broad public support. So we'll do the same thing for Ottawa. And one way to be in, so we'll be in touch with the organizations, including yours, but also individuals. If you were to sign OntarioClimateAction.ca or noNewNuclear.ca, you will then, if you request it, be added to our email list. And then every maybe 2 weeks, you get an update and you get informed, and we invite you to distribute leaflets to your neighbors, to your friends and colleagues, just to keep, we have social media streams, Ontario Clean Air Alliance, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, where we have a social media manager where we're cranking out really nice infographics and encouraging people to send letters. And so all of these actions are just building. And then, of course, if your congregation were to jointly write letters or send letters to your MPPs, to the premier, to, the more action, request meetings of the mayor, like just slowly build support for these ideas politically and, build public support. That's what our sort of campaign goals are.
Thank you. And there's been a request for someone to put the links to these organizations and websites in chat. And I would say that if you go to Climate Action and Advocacy on our own website, there is some information there as well. But I think there's going to be some action on your behalf. And just with respect to seeing the chat, once we've started this way, we're in this mode. So I get to see the chat and you don't. Plus, it's distracting for people that you can't listen to Angela's comments if you're reading chat. So I'm the one that gets distracted. Okay. A question on the effect on birds and other species from large solar farms in particular, but also the wind turbines.
Well, I know there's some controversy around that, but Health Canada has done extensive studies, and as have health agencies from around the world. There's been many, and they have been unable to really determine evidence of large harm to animals and birds. So I think for the most part, it's anecdotal that people are harmed by wind and solar farms, and which doesn't mean we should discount that, but there is no large scale evidence of that. I think it comes down to aesthetics. People don't like the look of them. But, there are downsides to every electricity option. There's downsides to existing dams. They produce methane. And there's also very serious downsides to gas and nuclear power. So we have to make some choices. And so we have to get our electricity from somewhere. And really the best opportunity is to reduce supply altogether. And that is our number one choice that we continually advocate for.
And how do you reduce consumption and demand? Well,
individuals can reduce their own demand substantially, but really the greatest opportunity is at the industrial and the larger scale, like for the IESO to incentivize industry and government buildings, et cetera, to reduce their demand. So it actually pay people to reduce their demand, to invest in weather stripping and insulation and new windows. And we can all do that as individuals as well. We can tighten the envelope of our own homes. But we really need government to direct the ISO to incentivize industry and business to reduce on a much grander scale, and also to pay individuals, to incentivize individuals to make those kinds of changes in their own homes.
I know you're the Alliance in Ontario, but do you have any comments about electricity use and need in the north? Well, I suppose even Northern Ontario.
I think the greatest opportunity, so that, the nuclear industry wants to send SMRs up there, but there's really no interest at this point. There's no demand. The First Nations community of Ontario, once again, they come out several times in recent years, but they continue to come out and say that they do not want SMRs in their local communities. The opportunity is for them to create little micro or smaller microgrids of wind and solar. That's really the future of smaller northern communities. And, conservation, ground source heat pumps, all of that, geothermal. There's lots of renewable energy options that are available to us.
Yeah, for our own reduction. I think it's harder in the north for ground heat, isn't it? Yeah,
For
sure. Bill Gates, in one of his recent books, is very supportive of nuclear plants.
Who is? Oh, Bill Gates, yeah.
And says the only way we'll be able to reduce our emissions fast enough to mitigate the climate disaster is through nuclear. How do you respond to that?
Well, he has a financial stake in it, and he's asking for government funds. The only countries in the world that are investing in nuclear power are countries that are investing government funds. So, if the industry wants to spend the next 10 years developing it on their own dollar, just like wind and solar have been, then let the industry do that. Why are they coming for handouts from the federal and provincial governments?
Right.
And then likewise, when it comes to the waste and proliferation issues and accidents, you and I are responsible for all those things, not this private industry that can then just walk away, and just like the oil industry is walking away from their stranded assets.
A question about transmission, I guess, is there lots of research to reduce the loss from the electrical grid as it flows through wires?
I can't really comment on that, but the import of water power from Quebec, there will be some loss along the lines, but it's not substantial.
Okay. And I think you partly answered this, but there's a question about the initial cost of buying Quebec power was stated in terms of adding tie-ins, but would there not need to be a revamp of the OPG power grid to get power from Quebec to, say, Toronto?
Not very much. So, for example, we have already the Wynne government made two relatively small deals with Quebec to show that it could happen. I think the second one was 2 megawatts, and they were in the process of negotiating a third at 8 megawatts that got stalled, and then the Ford government discontinued or never reinitiated those negotiations. But like I showed in that one slide, we have the transmission grid already that we could be importing 16.5 to 18.5 megawatts of electricity. So we're already there with relatively small incremental upgrades, one being through Ottawa for 80 million. We could be importing much more water power from Quebec. So no, there isn't a technical reason for not importing more Quebec water power. The reason is political and competition. Wind and solar and water and conservation are all competition to the nuclear rebuild program and the gas ramp up, which are both industries of both Bruce Power and OPG. And
back to the nuclear and the comment on Bill Gates. Could you elaborate on his financial stake in nuclear? Are you aware of what it is?
I haven't followed it, but he owns Terra Power, I believe. Bill Gates owns Terra Power, which is a new nuclear industry, and yeah, so he's hoping to cash in on, on customers taking, like you and I, taxpayers, taking huge risks for the nuclear industry. Why would we take risks on very high cost, slow to roll out, potential deadly, dangerous, waste producing, proliferation enhancing power sources when we have wind, water, solar, geothermal, biomass, heat exchangers, all these options that are ready to roll out and are already much, much cheaper? Why would we take the risk when we have lower cost, cheaper renewable options already now, could roll out much faster? And, climate change demands that we roll out renewable options now. What happens if in 10, we put all our eggs in the nuclear basket and they don't come together in 10 years? Maybe they're not producing electricity for 20 years. Meanwhile, we're wasting all that time instead of rolling out renewables now. We can roll out wind and solar farms in 2 to 5 years now, boom.
So
and if there's an accident, we don't have the same waste proliferation accident potential with wind, water, solar that we do with nuclear.
So what would you ask Krista Freeland in the upcoming budget with respect to power?
Well, not to give any money to the nuclear industry, for one. So we know that the feds just funded $20 million to a company just outside of Toronto. We're expecting announcements for another 20 million or more to New Brunswick SMR companies. They're already knee deep with SMR companies in the Chalk River area, just outside of Ottawa. I know you've had speakers about that, so I won't dive into that. But the SMR community is hoping to be building out and researching and developing a suite of SMRs in the Chalk River area. And that's with federal funding. So we really need the federal government to get out of the nuclear industry altogether. I would say don't even let them set up shop here. But without federal funding, they wouldn't be setting up shop here. They're relying on the Canadian taxpayer to prop them up. Just as the can-do industry in the past relied on the Canadian taxpayer, billions, tens of billions of dollars, the Liberal governments, successive Liberal governments funded into the Canadian nuclear industry. enough funding for the nuclear industry. And now it's private. These are private companies, mostly American companies, setting up shop in Canada, asking for federal funds to develop their nuclear technology, which is at minimum a decade away, which has many potential risks, which we're going to get stuck with the waste, stranded assets, health problems,